So it's really a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Professor John Witte is a name that has been on my radar for years, a very distinguished author in the area of law and history in the Protestant tradition. And he is here with us today to speak to us on the Decalogue in the Protestant tradition. Now, I'm going to do a very brief bio. He's the Robert W. Woodruff Professor of Law, McDonald Distinguished Professor of Religion, and Faculty Director of the Center for the Study of Law and Religion at Emory University. He's a leading specialist in legal history, human rights, religious freedom, marriage and family law, and law and religion. He has published over 300 articles, 18 journal symposia, and 45 books, which I think is sinful. It's so great, you know. But no, it's a huge, huge achievement. John, it's over to you.
Okay, thank you so very much for having me here. Thank you, Craig, for your lovely invitation and introduction. Wonderful for all of you souls to spend time with us here. I didn't know that my work was going to the dogs, but I guess literally that's the case today, which is perhaps a good indication of my colleagues' sentiments about me too. Thanks to Craig and to David McElroy and Jordan Pickering for their kind provisioning, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. A few, Alan in particular, getting up at 4:30 in the morning. That is impressive. So the thesis I would like to argue today is twofold. First, that the Protestant Reformation revolutionized not only theology in the church, but also law and the state. And second, that the Decalogue was a vital instrument for this twin religious and legal revolution. The theologians and church historians among you will know of the role of the Decalogue in organizing and integrating early modern Protestant creeds, catechisms, and confessions. The Decalogue, I'd like to argue and illustrate for you a bit today, played a comparable role in integrating early modern Protestant laws and liberties. Let's first remember the broader context, distilling and broadening a bit the first part of the paper that you have sent to you in advance of this forum. The Protestant Reformation erupted in 1517 with Martin Luther's posting of the 95 Theses on the church door in Wittenberg, and 3 years later, his burning of the books of medieval canon law and sacramental theology in a bonfire at the city gates of Wittenberg. The early Reformation soon split into four main branches. Lutheranism spread throughout the Northern Empire and Scandinavia and their later colonies, consolidated by Luther's large and small catechisms of the 1520s and the Augsburg Confession and its apology in the next decade. Anabaptists fanned out in small communities throughout Europe, Russia, and eventually North America, most of them devoted to the founding religious principles of the Schleitheim Confession of 1527 and its many, many local variations. Anglicanism was established in England by King Henry VIII and Parliament in the 1530s, and once consolidated by the Great Bible of 1539 and the Book of Common Prayer in the 39 Articles, it spread throughout the global British Empire. Reformed communities, modeled on John Calvin's Geneva and anchored by Calvin's catechisms, liturgies, and his institutes, spread throughout North Europe, Scotland, England, and North America. While new confessions and creeds and catechisms helped to inspire and integrate these Protestant movements, it was new laws that usually set them in motion and consolidated these religious reforms. Hundreds of elaborate church ordinances and legal reformations, as they were called, were issued in Lutheran, German, and Nordic lands. Hundreds of new church orders governed the small, self-sufficient Anabaptist communities. Parliament's Supremacy Act of 1534 declared the English monarch to be supreme head of the Church and Commonwealth of England, triggering a welter of new civil and ecclesiastical laws issued by the Crown, Parliament, and Convocation. Geneva's Reformation Edict of 1536 was echoed in hundreds of Calvinist communities throughout Northern Europe and North America and grounded elaborate new Reformed legislation and case law. All these early Protestant laws were in part declarations of freedom from medieval Catholicism. Freedom of the individual conscience from intrusive canon laws and works righteousness ethics, freedom of political officials from clerical power and privilege, freedom of local clergy from centralized papal and conciliar rule. Together, these new Protestant laws broke the international rule of the medieval Catholic Church and its canon law, permanently and perilously splintering Western Christendom into competing nations and regions, each with its own religious and political rulers. The Reformation also triggered a massive shift of power and property from the church to the state. Protestant state rulers now assumed jurisdiction over numerous subjects and persons previously governed by the church and its canon law, including marriage and family law, poor relief and charity law, education, inheritance, oath swearing, and many forms of criminal law and public morality. In some Protestant lands, the state also assumed new jurisdiction over church polity, property, clergy, and spiritual life. These massive shifts in legal power and property from church to state did not signal the sudden secularization of law in Protestant lands or the cessation of traditional Christian influences on Western law. For all of their early attacks on medieval canon law, Protestant leaders eventually transplanted many Catholic canon law rules and procedures directly into the new Protestant state laws of their day. Some of these provisions trimmed of theologically offensive provisions, others reformed in light of new teachings, but many retained largely in their medieval forms, but now administered by the state instead of the church. Moreover, in creating other new state laws, Protestant authorities drew anew on Christianized Roman law and medieval civilian jurisprudence, Christian republican and humanist legal and political thought, biblical law and Talmudic jurisprudence, all of which were staples in the new Protestant law faculties of the universities. And Protestant leaders worked hard to convert some of their own new distinctive theological teachings and accents, especially concerning freedom, family, charity, education, and crime, into exotic new legal forms. What emerged from the Protestant Reformation movements in the 16th and 17th centuries were impressive new legal syntheses that skillfully blended classical and biblical, Catholic and Protestant, civilian and canonical teachings. It was the Decalogue that helped to integrate and stabilize these new Protestant legal teachings, particularly in Lutheran and Calvinist lands, as you saw in the paper that was circulated. 16th century Lutheran jurists called on the state's authorities to build their positive laws on the basis of the Ten Commandments, just as Lutheran theologians had called on church officials to build their new catechisms and creeds on that same Ten Commandments foundation. Martin Luther had set the stage for this development very early on. In 1522, 5 years after the Reformation began, he wrote, and I quote, "The Decalogue is not just the law of Moses, but the law of the whole world, inscribed and engraved in the minds of all men from the foundation of the world." 3 years later, he wrote again, and I quote, "A prince, parliamentarian, or judge who knows and follows the Decalogue can advise, help, comfort, judge, and decide both spiritual and temporal matters, and is qualified to sit in judgment upon all doctrines, estates, spirits, laws, and whatever else is in the world," unquote. Luther's Wittenberg colleague and successor, Philip Melanchthon, a theologian, moralist, and jurist, built on Luther's view. The Christian magistrate, he said, is a voice of the Ten Commandments within the earthly kingdom. When you think of the Decalogue, when you think of the prince, have in mind him holding the two tables of the Decalogue in one hand and a sword in the other. Those 10 commandments are above all the works which he must protect and maintain, using the sword if necessary. They are also the source from which all written laws must flow, and by which all statutes should be governed. Melanchthon took this image of holding the Decalogue in one hand and a sword in the other directly into his understanding of the nature and purpose of political authority and positive law, and his views became symbolic and indeed axiomatic for many Lutheran theologians and jurists over the next 2 centuries. For Melanchthon, the Christian magistrate is both the custodian and enforcer of the Decalogue. His positive laws are to be organized in accordance with its 2 main tables. The first table of the Decalogue, Melanchthon argued, supports positive laws that govern spiritual morality, the relations between persons and God. The second table supports positive laws that govern civil morality, the relationships between and among persons. As custodians of the first table of the Decalogue, Melanchthon wrote, magistrates must pass laws against idolatry and blasphemy and Sabbath breaking, offenses that the first table prohibits on its face. Magistrates must also, quote, establish pure doctrine and right liturgy, prohibit all wrong doctrine, punish the obstinate, and root out the heathen and the heterodox. Worldly rulers, Melanchthon wrote, who have abolished idolatry and false doctrine in their territories and have established the pure doctrine of the gospel and the right worship of God, have acted rightly. Indeed, all Christian rulers are obliged to do the same. Melanchthon's move toward the establishment of religion by state law was a marked departure from Luther's original teaching, especially in his Freedom of the Christian in 1520. In 1523, for example, Luther rather firmly rebuked Melanchthon in saying earthly laws must extend no further than to life, property, and other external things on earth. For God cannot and God will not allow anyone but himself to rule over the soul. Thus, when the earthly power presumes to prescribe laws to souls, as the Pope has so long done, it encroaches upon God and God's government, and only seduces and corrupts souls. Luther eventually softened this stance a bit, particularly in his late life railings against Jews and antinomians and Anabaptists, and in his recognition that sometimes the prince had to step in as an emergency bishop in times of spiritual crisis and church decay. But Luther remained firmly opposed to the political magistrate defining by positive laws what doctrines and liturgies were orthodox, what heterodox. Melanchthon, like other early Lutherans, held similar views in the 1520s and 30s, but he eventually retreated from this position in response to the intense religious rivalries between and among Catholics and Protestants in Germany and the perennial outbreaks of what he called spiritual radicalism, monstrous absurdities, and diabolical outrages against God and his church. To allow such blasphemy and spiritual chaos to continue without rejoinder, Melanchthon believed, was ultimately to betray God and to belie the essence of the political office as a vice-regency of God. After all, the Christian magistrate, he said, must maintain external discipline according to both tables of the Decalogue. Idolatry, blasphemy, false oaths, untrue doctrine, and heresy are all contrary to the first table. So the magistrate must prohibit, abolish, and punish these depravities, and force his followers to accept the Holy Gospel, to compel them to come in, as the Bible said, to believe, confess, and direct others to true divine service and the glory of God. With this teaching, Melanchthon helped to lay the theoretical basis for the welter of new religious establishment laws that were promulgated in early modern Lutheran Germany and Scandinavia. These laws set out in numbing detail the Orthodox Lutheran confessions and doctrines, songs and prayers, lectionaries and liturgies and rites and polities and properties of the church that the state now enforced and supported and in part funded. The principle of cuius regio, eius religio, whose ever region, his religion, set forth in the 1555 Religious Peace of Augsburg and expanded in 1648 in the Peace of Westphalia, rested ultimately on Melanchthon's theory that the magistrate's positive law was to use the first table of the Decalogue to establish proper Christian doctrine, liturgy, and spiritual morality, and to support the state churches and clerics that lived in accordance with these spiritual laws. Vestiges of this religious establishment policy still remain in place in parts of Germany and Scandinavia to this day, although disestablishment campaigns are now well underway in the new millennium. As custodians of the second table of the Decalogue, Melanchthon and other Lutherans argued, magistrates are called to govern the multiple relationships by which God has bound persons together. Melanchthon listed a whole series of positive laws that properly belong under each of the commandments of the second table, and a whole coterie of jurists in his wake put far more detail on this skeletal framework. The commandment to honor thy father and thy mother, Melanchthon said, supported positive laws that prohibit and punish disobedience of authorities, whether the state or parents or guardians or bishops or teachers, employers, and others. And this commandment lies at the foundation of the constitutional laws governing both the state and the church. Thou shalt not kill undergirds laws prohibiting unlawful killing, violence, assault, battery, wrath, and other crimes and torts against the body of one's neighbor. Thou shalt not commit adultery, together with thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife or maidservant, was the foundation for various sex crimes. Adultery, fornication, prostitution, pornography, obscenity, and more, now newly enforced by the state rather than the church. The commandments also grounded new positive laws of marriage and family, parents and children, master and service that emerged in Lutheran states in place of the elaborate medieval canon law on point. Thou shalt not steal informed laws that outlaw theft and burglary, embezzlement, and similar offenses against another's property, as well as waste or noxious use of one's own property. And this commandment also grounded the positive laws of property, how to acquire, use, maintain, encumber, and alienate real and personal property alike. Thou shalt not bear false witness, grounded positive laws that punish perjury, dishonesty, fraud, defamation, and other violations of a person's reputation or status in the community, as well as breaches of promise and contract. And finally, thou shalt not covet was the foundation of the positive laws of privacy and protection of one's household business and standing against the privations of covetous neighbors. This was a markedly different organization of the law than prevailed under the medieval church's canon law, which was organized in part under the seven sacraments. In medieval legal lore, the sacrament of marriage supported the canon law of sex, marriage, and family life. The sacrament of penance supported the canon law of crimes and torts, and indirectly the canon law of contracts, oaths, charity, and inheritance, too. The sacrament of extreme unction supported the sophisticated canon law of charity and poor relief, and a vast network of church-based guilds, foundations, hospitals, and other charitable institutions set up by the decedent. The sacrament of ordination became the foundation for a refined canon law of corporate rights and duties of clergy and monastics. And the sacraments of baptism and confirmation supported a new constitutional law of natural and positive rights and duties of Christian believers. Melanchthon and many other Lutheran jurists and moralists used the Ten Commandments instead of the seven sacraments to organize the various systems of positive law. and they looked primarily to the state instead of the church to promulgate and enforce these positive laws on the basis of the Ten Commandments. And Melanchthon's argument provided a further rationale beyond Luther's to support the transfer of legal authority from the church to the state. This use of the Decalogue became one standard way, among others, of systematizing early modern Protestant state laws in Lutheran and other Protestant lands in Europe and North America. The Ten Commandments also became a principal means for early modern Protestants to organize and advocate their claims to religious and civil rights and liberties against their tyrannical oppressors. Protestants did not invent rights and liberties. Many of those go back to classical and medieval sources. But as they faced mounting persecution in the mid-16th century onward, Protestants had to categorize which of these rights and liberties were so fundamental that if chronically and pervasively breached by a tyrant, could trigger the foundational right of resistance and revolt. Lutherans in the 1550s faced this question in Magdeburg and other cities laid siege by the Holy Roman Emperor, seeking to enforce by the sword the decrees of the Catholic Council of Trent. Puritans and Presbyterians in England and Scotland faced this when the two Marys began to persecute and slaughter them with a vengeance for their Protestant heresies. Dutch Calvinists faced the same when the Spanish emperor imposed the Inquisition on them, killing them by the thousands, if not tens of thousands. French Calvinist Huguenots faced this too, when church and state authorities conspired to inflict the bloody St. Bartholomew's Day massacre that killed some 100,000 Calvinists in a month of bloody genocide. In response, various Protestants, but especially Calvinists, developed a theory of fundamental religious and civil rights, based in no small part on the Decalogue. Theodore Beza, John Calvin's successor in Geneva, laid out one of the fullest early formulations of this in the 1570s, in direct response to the bloody St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. The issue Beza faced was how to ground his doctrine of God-given natural rights, and how to decide which of these rights were so inalienable and inviolable that if persistently and pervasively violated, could trigger the foundational right to disobedience, resistance, revolt, even outright revolution. The first and most important right, Beza reasoned, had to be the religious rights of liberty of conscience and free exercise of religion. Persons are, after all, first and foremost the subjects of the Creator God, and called to honor and worship God alone above all else. If the magistrate, created by this same God and a representative of God's authority on earth, breaches these religious rights and duties, then nothing can be sacred and secure any longer. What is essential to the protection of the liberty of conscience and free exercise of the people's religion? Beza continued catechetically. Well, it's the ability to live in full conformity with the law of God. But what is the law of God? First and foremost, said Beza, the Decalogue, which set out the various duties of right living that a conscientious Christian needs to discharge in effective exercise of the faith. What do these commandments entail? Well, both religious duties and rights based on the first table of the Decalogue and civil duties and rights based on the second. Foremost among the religious rights of the people based on the first table, said Beza, were liberty of conscience, the right of a person to choose and change his or her faith without coercion or control, without reprisal or consequence. He included freedom of mission, the right to spread the faith not by the sword, but by teaching, conviction, and exhortation. He spoke of the free exercise of religion, by which he meant principally the right of believers to join in pious gatherings, and there to hear the word of God and have communion of the sacraments. He spoke of freedom of church government, the corporate right of each religious group to govern itself without state interference. He stressed the freedom to educate, the right of parents and guardians to bring up their children in their own form of faith. And finally, he noted the freedom to emigrate, the right of persons to move unencumbered to another place where their religious rights would be more readily respected. Beza also elaborated civil rights under individual commandments of the second table of the Decalogue. The commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," he said, supported the natural right to life and liberty and bodily protection. This included the right to nourish and protect and care for one's own life and limb and that of dependent family members, the right to carry arms for protection, the right to proportionate defense of oneself and one's possessions and one's family that are needed for life, freedom from homicide, battery, and personal injury, and freedom from unjust bodily punishment or cruel and unusual imprisonment. The commandment, "Thou shalt not commit adultery or covet the neighbor's wife," supported what Beza called the right to purity and chastity, the right to be kept oneself holy, chaste, and pure in mind and body, and to restrict and resist the attentions, the harassment, and actions of others who threatened or violate the same. The commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," supported the right to property, to the fruit of one's labors, and to goods that one uses and enjoys, to the privacy and protection of one's home, shop, business, and belongings. The commandment, "Thou shalt not bear false witness," protects the right to a good reputation, the right to enjoy one's honor, good name, and standing, to be free from perjury and defamation and slander, and to be assured of due process and procedural justice in public, private, and penal cases alike. These commandments about honoring parents, not committing adultery, or coveting one's neighbor, said Beza, supports the right to a family, the right to marry, to procreate, to nurture, and to educate one's children in the privacy of one's home. This Decalogue-based system of fundamental rights and liberties, among many other formulations, became axiomatic for later Protestants as they sought to create the first constitutional constraints on autocratic authority and to articulate the grounds and procedures for resistance and revolt. Their rights formulations became axiomatic within and beyond Protestant lands. It is no small anecdote that by the 1650s, Protestants on both sides of the Atlantic had developed, defended, and died for each and every one of the rights that would appear a century and a half later in the United States Bill of Rights and contemporaneous American state constitutions. A couple of decades ago, my late great mentor, Harold Berman, gave a series of lectures on law to packed houses in a dozen universities in China. One of his distinguished Chinese respondents asked Berman publicly whether one needed to believe in God or in the Ten Commandments in order to have a just legal order. It would certainly help, Berman quipped immediately. But no, he went on diplomatically, you don't have to believe in God, the lawgiver, but you have to believe in something. You have to believe in law, at least. If you can't accept God, then focus just on the law that God has written on all of our hearts. Even children intuitively sense this law within us, written on our hearts. Every child in the world will say, "That's my toy." That's property law. Every child will say, "But you promised me." That's contract law. Every child will say, "It's not my fault. He hit me first." That's tort law. Every child will say, too, "Mommy or Daddy said I could." That's constitutional law. What this anecdote underscores is that law ultimately comes from our human nature, and our human nature is ultimately an image of God. And God is the ultimate author of the law and of the basic rights and duties that the law sets out. And the most sublime source and summary of that law is the Decalogue. Thank you very much.
You know, in Old Testament studies and in theology, there's quite a strong debate about whether the Decalogue is universal or particular. And now my sense is that in the Protestant tradition, the overwhelming consensus is that it's universal. But would that be correct?
Yes, I think that is correct. And the Protestant jurists and theologians of the 16th and 17th century worked very hard to show the parallels in other ancient legal systems, to look at other formulations of some of the commandments. Um, they spent some time, for example, with the Noahide laws and thinking about what those meant in the context of Talmudic jurisprudence. They looked at some of the ancient Greek and Roman earliest sources and extracted from them sets of natural law principles that many times were consistent with the provisions of the Decalogue, not in every particular and not in the same order, but nonetheless with consistency. Um, a few interesting parallels that emerge from that exercise is that many of these ancient provisions have a set of natural laws or principles that govern the cult, that govern religious activity, and the relationships between and among the clergy and laity, as we would call it, and the earthly expression of the faithful and God or the gods. And they had separate provisions dealing with questions of how we interact with each other. That is commonplace in these ancient treatises in the 16th and 17th century. That was pretty clear already in some of the modern things that we have. You would know better, Craig. Those studies have kind of underscored this. There are a few provisions that are missing from the Decalogue if you compare them to some of the ancient understandings in the day. One is the lack of an explicit procedural justice or due process provision, which the Noahide law lifts up and which is often echoed as an essential part of how we do justice and how natural law needs to be instantiated. There's also a pretty strong respect, both in the Noahide law and some of the other laws in the day, of the concern for the animals. The dogs that have been listening in are probably worried about not hearing their concerns being met. In point of fact, the Noahide law and a number of laws, some Greek and Roman, Mesopotamian, and Egyptian traditions talk about not the rights of animals, but they talk about the laws governing human interaction with the created order, particularly animate things, and trees and plants and animals being included. So there's an interesting robustness about the way the Decalogue gets formulated in its Christian and Jewish terms. I think the fact that it has many antecedent and analogous provisions in the ancient world is just a testimony to the idea that the Decalogue is in many ways a brilliant summary of the natural law, and that the law written on the hearts for others also impels them as they formulate these in positive law forms to give expression to many of the same provisions.
If I can just come back on that, John. So, theologically, would you connect Decalogue with natural law? Or because I mean, and I think Michael will raise this issue as well. The context of the Decalogue is at the heart of a covenant, and it seems to me it's very clearly ancient Near Eastern law. So I'm interested in how that relates to what we might call general revelation as opposed to natural law.
Yeah, I think the question becomes to what extent are there other normative formulations that are not necessarily law and enforceable law at that? but nonetheless probative for the good life and the good society, and especially one's good relationship in loving God, neighbor, and self. Certainly, there are many other formulations. Covenant formulations are certainly amongst them, and we have iterations of covenant throughout the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. I think those are articulated as principles of right living as much as they are laws to be enforced by any particular authority. And I think it's important. The issue becomes that distinction, I think, is important, full stop. I think the question becomes whether the Decalogue, that certainly is, as recorded in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy 5, a codification of the principles of the covenant that Yahweh has with his chosen people of Israel, is the a chrysalis under which this universal law was born, or a particular distillation of a set of norms that govern God's ancient people. And that gets into the hard question that you theologians know better than I, which is how do we deal with all the laws of the Old Testament? And the distinctions that I think that Augustine made famous, but many others have before him and after him have said the distinction between ceremonial laws, juridical laws, and moral laws. That differentiation of three different kinds of laws, ceremonial laws distinctive to this ancient people under God's covenant, juridical laws, one way of expressing the instantiation of these moral laws and covenant obligations in particular forms, which may be probative, and then moral laws, which are universal but included in the covenant. I think is the way that we have to sort out the question about the independence of the Decalogue from its covenantal chrysalis. Um, and at least in the early modern Protestant tradition, in terms of classifying the Decalogue, the Protestants quite readily accepted the Decalogue as a universal moral law, even though it had juridical expression and ceremonial instantiation in the covenant with Moses and repeated again with Esther and the others. So I think that's how they would negotiate that question. It's an interesting one and a hard one to kind of sort out. This lawyer doesn't have the expertise to parse all the latest debates about this in biblical theology, but that's the way at least the early moderns would sort that out. And in my personal view, I do think the chrysalis idea of the covenant and then the expression of moral laws summarized amongst other places in the Decalogue is the best way to look at it. But that's
Well,
my personal view. It's not, I'm not articulating any particular denominational stand.
that's wonderful. Thank you.
Dr. Witt was very helpful. I'm just, I think perhaps the hair that I'm trying not to split is what do you mean by universal? And saying that um, it is a particular articulation of the universal truths which anyone should be able to access, Romans 1, from the natural law as being clearly evident. I think if it is are you saying that it is a particular articulation of universal truths, or are you saying that it is just universally binding? I
Mm.
guess I am making kind of maybe more of a theological distinction, and I don't want to sidetrack us um, on that. I think he raised a very good point about, the moral law, and specifically with relationship to Leviticus 19, where
Mm.
interspersed in the retelling of the Decalogue, you have economic principles about the
Yeah.
workplace being interjected with the exact same kind of rejoinder at the end of each one saying it is also universally morally correct
Yeah.
that you cannot exploit your workers.
Yeah.
So I guess that's where I'm trying to get the difference between universal and particular.
Yeah. So very good distinctions. Hair splitting for a couple of ball guys is a dangerous art form. So we got to be careful about this. There's much in peril. Sorry about that. Um, but I do think those distinctions that you're drawing, I think, are apt distinctions. And I think that most of the Protestant moralists and theologians and jurists who spoke to these questions simply overrode them. they talked repeatedly. It was an adage to basically say it is the law written on the heart, Romans 1, and rewritten in Scripture, and especially rewritten in Scripture in the Decalogue. And so for their view is the law written on the heart is the universal promptings of that inform our conscience that then take on not individualized expression or individualized ethics, but take on corporate expression in various kinds of formulations. And their view would be, in the 16th and 17th century at least, their view would be one powerful expression of that was the Decalogue. And then this is heresy, I know, for biblical scholars. And the Decalogue is in many ways the summary of all the laws, the 613 commandments in the Torah. And they spend a lot of time kind of walking how all the different commandments can be located in those 10 different provisions. That latter exercise, I think, is pretty fanciful, and it kind of betrays what their starting premise was, which was this is a universal law, and then that universal law provides principles to guide the individuals in her ethics, to provide a framework for thinking about how to articulate the laws of church, state, and family, and then we'll have various particular expressions and emanations that may or may not speak directly to the kind of Torah precepts that follow from the principles, but are situated in time, place, and manner concerns of the day. Um, I think the subtlety that you're offering is a subtlety that I respect, but it's not a subtlety that I think was very well known to our colleagues in the 16th and 17th century.
I'm curious if there was any Counter-Reformation pushback to the Decalogue innovations of the Reformation.
Very much so. Very much so. I mean, the Council of Trent of 1545 to 63 has all manner of different kinds of rejoinders. Among other things, it certainly strongly reiterates the need for a sacramental foundation for the law of the church, and that the law of the church is superior to the law of the state and provides it with correction, which provides it with direction, and if necessary, provides it with an alternative forum for the best way to live the life, the sacramental life that we're called to live in the church. Also, the Council of Trent issues the Catechism of 1566, and the Catechism of 1566 reclaims the role that the Decalogue should play in the understanding of one's own ethical life, one's own kind of moral compass, like the Decalogue, like the medieval catechisms, and indeed like the Protestant catechisms. They use the Decalogue as one of the organizing idioms for catechetical life, but they make very clear that this is for guiding us in our spiritual lives, not a set of norms that should be ensconced in state law or supplant the sacramentally grounded rules of the canon law. So those are direct rejoinders in part. You see this then specifically in certain areas like marriage and family, sex norms that emerge. The decree Timidsi of 1563, for example, just goes systematically through the Protestants' interpretation of those commandments of honoring father and mother, not committing adultery, not coveting one's neighbor, and building a state law of sex, marriage, and family law from the strength of that. And the decree Timidsi of 1563 basically very firmly rebukes that interpretation of those commandments and goes back again to the sacramental understandings of marriage. And you could do the same thing for a number of the other decrees of the council as well. So certainly the Counter-Reformation understood the foundational challenge that this shifting ontology of law and shifting jurisdiction, primary jurisdiction from church to state entailed, and answered it very, very fully. And hence the religious wars that follow in part. I mean, these were civilizational issues in their view. And there's no accident that Charles V and his successors in the Holy Roman imperial throne are in the business of going around in Protestant Europe and enforcing by the point of the sword the decrees of the Council of Trent. Sorry, guys, you are so far wrong. You're heretics, and we rebuke you not only theoretically, but also now by the point of the sword, encouraged in the same uh, by the church, who saw this as a civilizational challenge.
I mean, I understand the one is anchoring law in the sacraments, the other, the Decalogue. But so when it came to issues like law for marriage and sexuality and that, can you give us an example of the tangible difference that makes?
So, first, where do you go for marriage and family law? The state versus the church. In medieval times and in Catholic times after the Reformation, the church is still the point of call. Church courts decide upon questions of marriage formation, maintenance, and dissolution. Church courts provide hard questions of impediments and separation. Church courts decide on issues of child custody and eventually alimony and things of that sort. In Protestant lands, you went to the state. And state courts are the ones who are going to adjudicate these questions, sometimes informed by parallel ecclesiastical procedures early on, say Calvin's consistory courts or some of the Lutheran consistory courts, but those don't have final authority. They are simply hearings courts and mediation centers that the state ultimately has preemptory jurisdiction over. Some of the notable changes that emerge in questions of marriage formation. Because marriage is no longer a sacrament in Protestant lands, you do not have to have two baptized Christians in good standing who get married. You can marry a person of different faith and have that as an acceptable, valid marriage within the church. Secondly, a severe reduction in impediments to both engagement and marriage. Protestants and their sola scriptura methodology are very much focused on the impediments that we just heard about a little bit in Leviticus 18 and 19 and some of the others, and not the slew of impediments that emerges in medieval canon law. Third is the premium attached to marriage as a right and sometimes even a duty for any fit adult with the capacity to marry, unless they had the rare gift of continence, and the decision that monastic life and celibate ecclesiastical or clerical life was in many ways a courting of sexual sin and not a necessary condition for service. And there's a strong new emphasis upon the right and sometimes the duty to marry, the right of divorce in the event of cause, and not just separation from bed and board, but in fact divorce, the severing of the covenant, and by reason of the severing of the covenant because of a breach of a indispensable condition, the right both to be free from that marriage and the right to remarry. And I can go on with a few other examples about child things and the like. But it is a seismic shift.
Hmm.
And you can play the same thing in the laws of charity and social welfare and the laws of education, some of the powerful new laws of criminal law, and the shifting of this from a sacramental framework that is governed principally by the inner forum of the confessional and the external forum of the church courts gives way to a system that diminishes the role that the church and consistory courts and the clergy play in the administration of the law, and shifts much of that responsibility to the Christian magistrate. And the Christian magistrate now suddenly has jurisdiction and necessarily has to grow bureaucracy to be able to absorb that jurisdiction in practice.
I did see that you have written a book that does detail ancient sources that deal with these types of concerns and laws. And I was wondering, just briefly, if you could outline perhaps some of the earliest, and I'm interested in the history of thought on these things, especially the earliest where this idea was recorded. Uh, uh, Things, basically, two or three things. I'm thinking specifically the idea of the liberty of the conscience, the
Mm.
civil rights of the, what would qualify as a citizen, what that might have looked like, the free exercise of religion. Those, of course, are fundamental to us, but how far back does that idea really go? Thank you.
Yeah. This is in part asking me to trespass on your world of Torah and Talmud expertise, and you know some of these prototypical principles and sometimes practices are already in place in the ancient world. Certainly, the Roman law world, as it emerges from republic to empire, begins to craft provisions that are gathered around those two terms, jus and libertas, facultas too, and each of those terms, jus and libertas and facultas, start to take on rights type language. And certainly by the time we get to the second and third century, before the Christianization of the Roman Empire, and certainly after, as we get into later fourth and fifth century formulations, ideas of rights and liberties around conscience, around family life, around the capacity and the need for discrete things like marriage, the claim that one can make, which becomes a right to charity, the right of the church itself, the libertas ecclesia, that begins to emerge in fifth and sixth century Rome and then gets ensconced into Anglo-Saxon law. We find a lot of early formulations of this in the first half of the first millennium of the Common Era, and those become prototypes on which then the medieval tradition builds. The particular question of freedom of conscience and free exercise of religion, the Tertullian in the end of the second and early third century, for the first time talks about religious freedom as a fundamental or a natural right, and makes claims about freedom of conscience itself and free exercise of religion. That's the first formulation that we have of those terms as we have them, and they become foundational to the Western tradition's understanding of religious freedom. Another early prototype that we get is in the so-called Edict of Milan of circa 313, where Constantine and his fellow emperors kind of issue this edict that guarantees everybody the free exercise rights to choose the faith that they wish to choose without coercion and control, and which draw distinctions between the rights of the individual and her conscience, his conscience, and the rights of the church. And then finally also articulate an idea of restitution that should be done in the face of persecution after the fact. And these are all really important early provisions, and they become loci classici for just a millennium of reflections. They have a reception history that gathers around them. Robert Louis Wilkin does some interesting things with liberty in the things of God, I think the book is called, with Yale Press. He picks up some of these texts and runs with them. My little book on the blessings of liberty kind of lays out some of these early texts and their instantiation in the tradition. Brian Tierney, in particular, has done a great deal with the medieval jus commune, especially the canon law, and how it picks these things up. So there is a long tradition here. And yes, we take these things as dear and indeed for granted today. But they are not inventions of the Enlightenment or modern liberalism, as we're often led to believe. These are ancient tropes of the tradition that get reworked and rethought and generalized in their application as we move forward through the centuries.
Thank you. Yeah, so my question is about the relationship between the cuius regio eius religio principle and Melanchthon's theory. And Melanchthon seems to assume that the magistrate should enforce true Christian doctrine, and the principle of cuius regio eius religio allows different rulers to enforce different confessions. So does this represent a departure from Melanchthon's view, or is it a pragmatic development within the framework of magisterial responsibility for religion?
Yep, very good question. So the cuius regio eius religio principle is articulated for this archipelago of different polities in the Holy Roman Empire and beyond. 350 odd polities of various sizes and sorts, And what the religious Peace of Augsburg of 1555 says is that every polity can have its own established religion, a la Melanchthon. And if in Saxony you can do it this way, in Bamberg you can do it this way, in this little city state you can do it that way, and this prince has the power to articulate what that religion is that's established by law, and enforce it in the way that Melanchthon would have countenanced. He's dead by the time this comes along, but it's a principle very much consistent with that, but it's done at the micro level. It's done at the level of local principality, territory, and city state. A few city states already after the religious peace of Augsburg said, we want to be pluralistic. We want to have multiple faiths living together in our town. And sometimes that was just expediency. We've got a lot of Jewish and Muslim traders here. We need to figure out how to keep them around. We got a lot of people that are heretics, but they pay a lot of taxes and they provide us with soldiers, and we need to figure out how to keep them around. And so pluralism becomes expediency rather than, I think, theology. But the pure principle of eius religio, cuius religio, eius religio, presupposes every little community has one faith in one territory. The issue becomes whether it's only two faiths, Lutheranism or Catholicism, as the Peace of Augsburg says, or three faiths, Lutheranism, Catholicism, and Calvinism, as the Peace of Westphalia says. But all of them are presupposing local establishments. The kind of pan-country, pan-national, let alone pan-empire establishments that you see in the Anglican tradition or you see in Nordic lands, those are unusually wide, sweeping in their geography and in the population swept in. We tend in this principle of Augsburg and Westphalia to assume a small collection of polities, none of them particularly big, and then an increasing emphasis upon the jus emigrandi, the right to emigrate, the right and sometimes the duty to leave if you can't abide by the local polity. And then one more thing, just as a footnote, that what emerges in the application of the Peace of Westphalia is an attempt to say, we're not just going to change our religion every time we change our prince. And we start getting the invitation to democratic participation by the members of that little polity when the prince wants to do something different. And it becomes an interesting ascending and descending theory of religious legal systems. And so, look, if the prince wants to become a Catholic and everybody there is Lutheran, there's a negotiation that has to go on now, rather than simply superimposing his new Catholicism on this long Lutheran polity and kicking everybody out that doesn't abide because they have the right to leave. Over time, after 1648, that becomes a negotiated settlement rather than simply a totalitarian regime that could be put in place if there is resistance.
Thank you. You've mentioned a couple of times, John, the idea of a jus emigrandi. Was there ever a corresponding jus immigrandi? That's a rather contemporary thought for many of us. But did those 16th century reformers ever think about the right to receive or the duty to receive immigrants?
Yeah, that's interesting. Duty, yes. Right, no. That the duty to accept the refugee, the duty to bring in co-religionists from another polity that are struggling, that idea was a normal one. Calvin represents that in Geneva. Luther already in 1523, for example, in his that Jesus Christ was born a Jew, his pamphlet, basically uses that as an invitation. The Jews have to come back. They have all been dispersed to Poland and beyond. They have to come back. That idea of a duty to a act of Christian charity or a obligation to a co-religionist is very much part of the early calculus. I do not know. I have to look, and I'll write you if I find something. I don't know of the right to emigrate, which of course is a deeply contested question of politics to our day. That I do not see in the early sources, but I have to look. I don't. The escape was the important part, which is really cool because you think about it, now you've got the right and the duty to leave, and here you have the very powerful engine of colonization or emigration to the New World. You have the constant population of the new frontier in the New World. Every time, can't remember his name, David Borstein, the former Librarian of Congress, talking about 17th century New England. He said every time there was a theological controversy, there was a new colony born. And there's something about that interesting concept of the right and the duty to leave, sometimes at sword point or gunpoint, being an important part of movement. And add to that mission work and other things that induce people to want to leave for the sake of spreading the gospel. And you have some twin engines of migration that are really important.
Thank you, John, very much. This is an area, it's not my area, but it's always fascinated me. And I did once find myself lecturing on the law to the Christian Lawyers Fellowship, way out of my depth, but I was interested in Islam in Britain, Islamic law, and nobody seemed to be doing anything about that, believe it or not. So I have taken an interest as an English woman, and I'm not sure how many other English there are on the call, but I just wanted to point out one or two things that make England exceptional, and I'd like to know whether you've actually studied England, English law, the common law, in relation to the Decalogue, because the development, I think, is different. The Anglicanism, Henry VIII didn't found Anglicanism. That's slightly anachronistic. It's a word that didn't come in until the 19th century. So what he did was he caused a load of trouble and broke away from the Pope and set himself up rather like Trump, as he was a sort of Trump of his day, I think. And there was a settlement between the Protestants and the Catholics, and in fact, Parliament grew up in a church. So the whole kind of development of English common law was very different. There is an exceptionalism about us, which is why we are a thorn in the flesh for Europe. We didn't have such a thing as positive law, which I understood was based on Roman law, the Roman Codex, rather than the Ten Commandments. So yeah, the question: does the English exceptional experience figure on your in your thought?
The passing comment on Sharia and its application in contemporary Great Britain, I have written some on that in a book called Church, State, and Family, which deals with the hard question about to what extent can religious communities become a partial law unto themselves on fundamental matters for them, on which the state has taken jurisdiction, but whose provisions the religious faithful find to be contrary to their faith. And the hard question about what role canon law plays, what role Sharia plays, what role halakha plays in governing the voluntary faithful of isolated communities is a hard one. And you're mentioning that you're a woman. It underscores one aspect of this, which is many of these legal systems oftentimes come with grave, grave difficulty in dealing with basic gender equality and other things. Being under Sharia as a purported voluntary faithful member of the Islamic faith also subjects you to these massively patriarchal laws. And one would say canon law and halakha sometimes are of the same sort. As to your basic question and comment, I emphasized in my remarks that it's the Lutheran and Calvinist traditions of the so-called Protestant Reformation that do this more deliberative work with the Decalogue, and I deliberately excluded the Church of England from that story, in part because they are kind of a via media between the Catholic tradition and the various Protestant traditions, and deliberately so. And amongst other things, what emerges in, you know, Elizabeth's early reign in 1552 and 1559, when the reformation of ecclesiastical law was pressed. Parliament ultimately rejected it. And amongst the things in those reformations of ecclesiastical law were the lifting up of the Ten Commandments as an axiomatic starting point for church and family law. So you're quite right that England lives on its long-standing customs. England invokes powerfully the medieval canon law without the Tridentine reforms in place. I mean, you can read marriage and family, charity and poor relief, and other provisions, and you are closer to medieval canon law than you are to anything that obtains in post-Tridentine Catholicism or in 16th or 17th century post-Tridentine systems. So you get an interesting body of exceptions. You have also a robust church court system that lasts until the reforms of the 19th century.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a different kind of system. That all said, there is an interesting kind of ongoing Puritanizing of Anglicanism that emerges in several movements. And every time there's one of these Puritan infusions that emerge in the 16th century that come back powerfully in the Civil War or the Commonwealth period, and that come back again in the later 18th century, you have this kind of injection of Calvinist and Lutheran emphases on number one, natural law, number two, natural rights, and number three, sola scriptura ethics that privilege the Decalogue in unusual ways. And those have a bearing on catechesis. Those have a bearing on some of the arguments that are going to be heard by courts when cases come up. If you listen to, for example, the abolitionist debates that emerge in the Parliament and then emerge in the royal courts in the 19th and in the later 18th and 19th century, think Wilberforce et al. These guys are doing what any good hardy Protestant would do in the 16th century forward, which is adducing all of the biblical texts that Michael
right.
and other people have lifted up and used them. So yes, it is an exceptional tradition. It has its own kind of interesting hybrid, and it requires its own story, different from the one I told. One more thing. I've written a lot on the history of marriage, family, sexuality norms in the West. And there's a book called From Sacrament to Contract that I've done, and a book called The Sins of the Fathers. And both of those are, the Sacrament to Contract is a history of marriage models, and the Anglican model lifted up. And then Sins of the Fathers is a story of the sorry treatment of the non-marital child, the bastard, as he was called historically. And I kind of lift up the exceptional English regime in both instances as an interesting kind of story. And then the Reformation of Rights book kind of lifts up those 1640 to 1660 robust Commonwealth discussions of human rights and religious freedom that get squashed by the Restoration, but get picked up on our side of the water. And used in many ways.
Milton. Your First Amendment.
Absolutely.
So, one of the things that we are trying to do at the Kirby Lang Center is to retrieve the Decalogue as a way of serving the church and the culture today. But do you have, I don't know Emory University well, but I imagine that you are in dialogue with all sorts of different philosophies of law and so on and so forth. So how does one begin to connect the Decalogue to contemporary Western culture?
Number one, certainly through its continued maintenance as a fundamental part of religious worship and one's own Christian pious life, I think is essential. Number two, it plays a central role in education and indeed a controversial role in American education, public and private schools alike. Indeed, the main case before the U.S. Supreme Court today is a case about the Ten Commandments displays, which are being put back into Texas and Mississippi and other public school classrooms as a symbolic example of a fundamental moral code on which Western civilization and culture were built, and which informs, amongst others, some of the aspects of our Anglo-American, I should probably emphasize American, legal system. And this has been a perennial issue in contest in the United States. But I think the constitutional relaxation of the Establishment Clause is allowing for that kind of expression of the power, the symbolic power of the Ten Commandments as a distillation of moral teachings, if not natural law, and a fundamental piece of the education of the next generation. Whether that succeeds constitutionally is an open question, but I think it will succeed this time around, and therefore will have a prominent place in the education of the next generation of citizens in the United States. I think third, there is a revival of pretty robust natural law theory going on this side of the water, and perhaps there too. And natural law theory has all kinds of different expressions, both the traditional ones that we have from the jus commune and from Roman law and Jewish law and the like, but also kind of an interesting new religion and science discussion that's emerging about kind of natural foundations for morality, natural foundations for sociability and the like. And included in that revival of natural law thinking, in my view, should be a robust re-engagement with the Decalogue as a kind of foundational text. And I would say, I said in passing, but I should emphasize anew, this kind of new fascination with the Noahide covenant and the 7 rules of the Noahide covenant that parallel the Ten Commandments, but are more a little more oblique about some of the provisions, especially of the first table. And by reason of that, there's kind of a interesting Abrahamic conversation now about the Noahide covenant as a kind of summary of fundamental principles, some overlapping with the Decalogue, that Jews, Christians, and Muslims can embrace together and can be perhaps the foundation of common understanding. I have, just as a matter of apologetics, no difficulty holding up alternative formulations of these moral principles, in part because of the antecedent, back to my conversation with Michael a little while ago, the antecedent law written on the heart that informs them. And so I think the Decalogue can play a critical role there too. But I think it has to start in the heart, in one's own prayer closet and confessional life. It has to be, I think, powerfully ensconced and recognized and lived, importantly, lived in the church. And then I think opportunities for its cultural instantiation through educational systems, through symbolic expressions in public life and in public places, and its invocation appropriately in very hard issues about fundamental matters that sometimes get ensconced in culture wars, sometimes get ensconced in constitutional cases, I think are all germane. And remembering, the thou shalt not kills is a pretty powerful rebuke to some of the political nonsense going on. Thou shalt, I mean, some of these prohibitions against idolatry and the like, and the kind of fairly scary kinds of trumpeting of MAGA politics and things like that, and just being reminded of fundamentals, and the Decalogue as a foundation for being reminded of fundamentals is probably useful. And that has always been the case, and I think it could become the case again.